bias burnout. It's the invisible epidemic sweeping through workplaces, and it's costing companies billions in lost productivity. Today, we're diving into how this phenomenon is reshaping corporate culture and what it means for the future of work.
Wow, that's a bold statement. What exactly do you mean by bias burnout?
Well, it's this state of mental and emotional exhaustion that comes from constantly trying to navigate, confront, or avoid biases in the workplace. Imagine being in a meeting where you're so focused on not saying the wrong thing that you barely hear what anyone else is saying. It's like running a mental marathon every single day.
Oh, I can totally relate to that. Just last week, I was in a diversity training session, and I found myself overthinking every word I said. By the end, I was completely drained.
Exactly. And here's what's fascinating: this isn't just affecting a few individuals, it's becoming a widespread phenomenon that's impacting entire organizations. Studies show that employees experiencing bias burnout are 2.5 times more likely to leave their jobs within a year.
That's a staggering statistic. So, uh, how does this manifest in day to day work life?
Great question. One of the most common ways is through what experts call the treading on eggshells phenomenon. People become so hyper vigilant about their words and actions that they essentially create an internal surveillance system. This constant self monitoring leads to what psychologists refer to as cognitive depletion. Basically, your brain runs out of processing power.
Hmm, that makes a lot of sense. I've noticed in my own workplace that people seem hesitant to speak up in meetings lately, especially when we're discussing sensitive topics.
You're not alone in noticing that. In fact, a recent study by the Harvard Business Review found that in companies with high levels of bias burnout, employee participation in meetings dropped by up to 37%. It's like people are hitting an invisible mute button.
That's exactly what it feels like. But what about the flip side? I mean, aren't these diversity and inclusion initiatives supposed to make workplaces better?
Well, and this is where it gets really interesting. We're seeing a phenomenon called the weaponization of DEI. Essentially, well intentioned diversity, equity, and inclusion programs are sometimes being used as tools for control or punishment instead of education and growth.
Oh, wow. That sounds counterproductive. Can you give an example?
Sure thing. Imagine a scenario where an employee makes an unintentional mistake in using outdated terminology. Instead of it being a teachable moment, they're publicly called out and shamed. This creates a culture of fear where people are afraid to engage in any conversations about diversity for fear of saying the wrong thing.
That's so disheartening. It seems like it would completely undermine the goals of DEI initiatives.
Absolutely. And here's where it gets even more complex. This fear response is creating what some experts call a freeze response in workplace communications. People become so paralyzed by the fear of making a mistake that they stop contributing altogether.
So, if we're seeing all these negative effects, what are companies doing to address this?
That's a great question. And it's where we're seeing some really innovative approaches. Some organizations are moving away from what they call calling out to calling in. Instead of public shaming, they focus on private conversations that educate and guide people toward better practices.
Hmm, that sounds like a more constructive approach. How effective has it been?
The results have been pretty remarkable. Companies that have implemented calling in practices have seen a 40% increase in employee engagement in DEI initiatives and a 25% decrease in reported incidents of bias. But here's the kicker: they've also seen a 15% increase in overall productivity.
Wow, so addressing bias burnout isn't just about creating a more inclusive workplace, it's actually good for the bottom line.
Exactly. And that's what's really exciting about this whole field of study. We're starting to see that creating psychologically safe workplaces isn't just a nice to have, it's essential for organizational success in our increasingly diverse world.
You know, all of this makes me wonder about the long term implications. How do you think this will shape the future of work?
Well, that's where things get really interesting. Experts predict that within the next decade, we'll see a complete overhaul of how companies approach diversity and inclusion. Instead of one off training sessions, we're likely to see ongoing, integrated approaches that are woven into the fabric of daily work life.
That sounds like a big shift. Do you think companies are ready for that kind of change?
It's a mixed bag. Some forward thinking companies are already implementing these kinds of integrated approaches. For example, Salesforce has implemented what they call equality circles, regular, facilitated discussions where employees can openly discuss issues of bias and inclusion in a safe environment.
That's fascinating. It sounds like it could really help reduce some of that anxiety around these conversations.
Absolutely. And here's another interesting development: we're seeing a rise in what some are calling inclusion tech. These are AI powered tools that can help identify patterns of bias in everything from hiring practices to daily communications.
Oh, wow. So technology is playing a role in addressing this issue too. That's pretty cool.
It really is. But, and this is important, these tools are meant to supplement, not replace, human judgment and empathy. The most successful approaches we're seeing combine technology with robust human led initiatives.
So it sounds like addressing bias burnout is really about creating a holistic culture change.
You've hit the nail on the head. It's not just about policies or training, it's about fundamentally reshaping how we interact and work together. And here's what I find most hopeful about all of this: the recognition that perfection isn't the goal.
What do you mean by that?
Well, organizations that are successfully addressing bias burnout are those that explicitly normalize imperfection in these conversations. They create spaces where people can ask questions, make mistakes, and learn from them without fear of severe consequences. It's about progress, not perfection.
That's such a powerful shift in perspective. It makes me wonder how this could transform other aspects of workplace culture.
That's a great point. We're already seeing ripple effects in areas like innovation and creativity. When people aren't spending all their mental energy on self monitoring, they have more cognitive resources available for problem solving and creative thinking.
So, in a way, addressing bias burnout could actually lead to more innovative workplaces.
Exactly. And that's really the key takeaway here. Addressing bias burnout isn't just about reducing stress or improving DEI initiatives, it's about creating workplaces where everyone can thrive and contribute their best work. And in today's competitive business landscape, that's not just good for individuals, it's essential for organizational success.
Well, this has been incredibly eye opening. Any final thoughts on what our listeners should take away from this discussion?
I think the most important thing to remember is that change starts with awareness. If you're feeling symptoms of bias burnout, that constant anxiety about saying the wrong thing or that exhaustion from navigating these issues, know that you're not alone. And more importantly, know that there are constructive ways to address it, both individually and organizationally. The future of work is one where diversity isn't just tolerated, but truly celebrated and leveraged for success.
That's a really powerful note to end on. Thanks for this fascinating discussion.
Thank you. And to all our listeners out there, remember, creating inclusive workplaces is a journey, not a destination. Be patient with yourself and others, stay curious, and keep the conversation going. Until next time.